What's up, dudes, and welcome back to the El Camino project. Getting back into it where we left off from last season. As you can see here, I'm pulling out the drive shaft because behind the scenes, behind the camera, or the other side, I was figuring stuff out, lining stuff up, figuring out where I need to go next and what I have to do. One thing I did notice, those frame rails that I did last time to line up for the trans tunnel and put the seat and everything else in it, they didn't line up right. Now, I could have let this slide and I could have worked around it and used it in a way that I could just make a bracket off somewhere a little spaced out, what may have you, but I also did this with the rear bumper. You guys saw that in the prologue probably. There was a part where I had a different back bumper on it, but looking at it now, when I see something that's not quite exactly perfect where I want it to be, I'm going to chop it off and I'm going to redo it. Because yes, this thing is designed, and the idea behind the whole El Camino build is to practice my fabrication skills and being able to build stuff. And I wanted to do it with this because I traded basically my 240 chassis for this car, and I've always dreamt of having an El Camino. One of my first cars, actually my very first car when I was 13, was an El Camino. One of my dad's very first cars I really enjoyed was an El Camino, the actual same year as this. So that's what made me want to build this car, and I'm really into drifting. And I'm a big dude, so I don't fit in small cars. If I put a cage in my RX-7, I'd be hitting my head on the helmet. So this is a practice building car because I have other projects that I think are going to be bigger and better. I wanted to use this to really dial everything in and figure stuff out. But at the same time, I'm not going to let something slide that I can easily take off and redo and change. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm chopping out the floor bar, trying not to ruin the crossbar too much because it's a real pain in the ass. And I'm redoing this whole floor piece because it's just not sitting right, and I got to make it sit right. Another part of this floor that is super important is the fact that my seats are going to bolt to it, so I want it to be all lined up so that I can put my seatbelt brackets, my seatbelts in the seats in the proper spot and everything else, and not have to worry about trying to mismeasure stuff. And I'm going to sheet metal the floor too, so having everything lined up properly with proper measurements and not having to guess how many inches off it was. It was only 1 3/4 inches off. It was actually the size of the pipe, which means I just welded the pipe into the wrong line. I put it on the wrong side instead of having the pipe to the left of the line that I marked. I probably had it on the right or something like that. But anyways, that all said and done, I finally got it back together, got it all lined up again. It's time to weld it back in and keep moving forward with the project. It was a little tricky to get these pipes kind of cut the way I needed them to fit properly. Now at this point, I'm doing it all with a hand grinder. I'm doing basically like throat cuts on the piping to get the right radius or whatever cut into it. I have a pipe notcher now, but I'm actually done all the fab work on the roll cage, as you will see, and everything I had to do with it. So for the next project, that pipe notcher is going to come in very handy. Part of the floor is going to hold the drive shaft cover. At first I was really considering making it removable, but then after seeing how much room I actually have underneath the truck, I don't think that was necessary. And then it would be just extra time, probably a full day of measuring out where I was going to put the holes and the bolts, or having to go out and get those rib nuts or whatever you want to call them, nutserts or something. Apparently my dad's got the tool in his shop, and I'm very fortunate to be able to use a lot of his tools whenever I need them and stuff. But I didn't have the hardware for it, I didn't think it was really necessary either. So right now what I'm doing is I'm putting these little L brackets because I want to put a sheet metal cover on it. I'm just going to square it off with the tin brake. It's kind of, I don't know if this is actually a tin brake, but it's sheet metal shear and bender that I'm going to use. So what I'm doing here is I'm figuring out exactly where my floor pan is going to line up with the trans tunnel and the drive shaft tunnel. I had to do a bunch of measurements and line it up so hopefully it fit kind of right. I'm gonna have to build my entire floor in this truck, car, whatever you want to call it, but I've got to do it all from scratch. So I want it to be strong enough that if something explodes like a universal joint and sends the drive shaft whipping around, that it's going to be not flying into the cab of the car. Same thing with the clutch and everything else. That's far enough ahead that I don't think I'll have to worry about that too much. And it's not going to be a big power, obviously. It's a 6-liter from a truck. It's bolted to a 5-speed, which is also from a truck, so this is going to be probably pretty barbaric. But getting these in is a step towards getting the interior in, and at this point, figuring that out is a key component. Building this entire El Camino, I kind of moved around back, forward, and did it all in stages. Like I worked in the interior for a little while, made sure everything was at a certain level where I knew exactly where I was going to be able to go and build from there. Here you can see that I'm starting to work on the firewall. A lot of these pieces was just like small steel that I got from Canadian Tire, Canac, or any of your kind of Home Depot sort of hardware store. So what I'm doing with this is that I'm just kind of making cross braces that I can see where roughly my floor is going to go. So it gives me kind of a limit to where I got to stop, and I can start designing my floor and everything around the motor and trans. Like I said before, the motor and transmission on this thing, if you check previous videos, is actually back about 8.5 to 9 inches depending where you measure from. The reason for that is I'm trying to balance it out like a Corvette because it has Corvette suspension. Now, a huge issue with that was obviously the firewall and the trans tunnel in stock form would not work. These motors are very, very far forward. In a stock El Camino, the front center of the wheel, where your bearing is, or your front axle if you want to call it that, lines up between cylinder 2 and 3 on the block. So it's basically right in the center of the block. Now the way the car is set up, the El Camino, the engine is actually behind the center point of the wheel, where the bearing is, where the kind of where the weight transfer, I guess, that's where the tire hits the ground. So I had to chop everything out of the firewall, the floor, everything else, make sure it's got room to clear it. And that means I'm gonna have to have a bigger firewall, or bigger trans tunnel, sorry, inside the El Camino, and try to make sure that I still have room to clear everything. So I'm using these slabs here to basically frame what that's going to be, making sure that it clears everything else. And now I'm starting to bend the parts that are going to hold the sheet metal for the drive shaft tunnel. I use the steel like that instead of just a sheet because I want it to be strong enough and it sits above the universal joint. That way if it blows up, it's probably going to hit that thick steel instead of just sheet metal. The sheet metal I use should actually be strong enough to... Yeah, I keep saying that. It sounds weird. The sheet metal I'm using should be strong enough that it won't send anything through if it does actually blow up. But I put these in to make it extra strong, have something to anchor to, and that way I can build my rear firewall off of it as well. And probably going to use some angle iron to anchor it in really well so that none of these firewalls move. I need the floor to be good and solid from anything coming up underneath it. Like I said, the drive shaft blows up, or the universal joints, I need that good and strong. And the rear end is obviously going to house the fuel cell, the radiator, and all that kind of stuff. So there's potentially flammable fluids back there. Maybe one day I'll get an oil sump. I'll probably run the tank back there. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's flammable, kind of dangerous. If the rad blows up, it's going to be real hot. So that rear firewall section I've also got to make pretty solid and pretty strong. And you know, anything can really happen. So I'm taking the sheet metal now and I'm making some templates. The easiest way to do this was to get in there with cardboard and really kind of fine tune it. The tricky part is the cage at the back of the truck, the back of the interior, it goes through, but because the pipes go through and reach the back, I had to make some sheet metal that goes around the pipes, and I couldn't use the bead roller on this because I had to be able to bend it to put it in. So here I went over to my dad's shop and started chopping up on the shear some of the pieces I need, the fine edges and stuff, and little adjustments I do by hand with the tin snips. My shop's not fully equipped. It's kind of crazy to say, but basically I built this entire El Camino with a hand grinder, a pipe bender, and a welder, and a few other odds and ends tools like this. So really I'm trying to get to and trying to show you guys is that you can kind of do anything. You don't have to like limit yourself to, you don't have the time or the space or the tools. I would have done this outside my driveway if I had to. So now moving on, I make another template. This piece was a lot easier because it's the whole big section. And at this point, I could have bead rolled that part to give it a little bit of strength. You'll see later on in this video series, I do a lot of bead rolling for the firewall, the floors, the trans tunnel that I put in, all that stuff. At this point in the videos, I actually didn't have access to the bead roller. I didn't have it in my shop, so I wasn't able to use it. Looking back now, I kind of regret it because that would have been a nice piece. When you see how everything else comes together, that definitely would have been a nice piece to bead roll as well. Gives it some sort of style, and that was a whole other thing that I had to learn. But as you can see here, it's a little tricky to get in, and I did have to bend it. So in retrospect, probably bead rolling it would have made it impossible to get into its spot. You can see me fighting there with it, so you get what I'm saying, right guys? So putting the sheet metal in, trying to line it up. Every time when you do something like this, you're definitely gonna have to do some fine trimming and stuff like that. Even if your template's spot on, the cardboard kind of moves around and bends with like when you push it, and it moves much more than the metal would. So sometimes when you get the metal in, there's a little bend that you weren't able to reach that you could with the cardboard because it's way less malleable. So you have to figure all that out and make sure your cuts and everything line up smooth so that you can weld it to it. And hopefully it's a nice clean surface. This metal has some sort of coating on it, which makes things a little bit interesting, but if you clean it a bit and you're real careful not to get too hot with the welder, you can spot weld that thing on. So what I went is I made sure it all fit. I lined everything up good to the best of my ability. And then I turned the heat way down on the welder. If you're lucky enough, your welder's new enough to have that little graph on the inside, it kind of tells you what's up, what's going on, and what to set your heat and your speed with your metal thickness, the gauge of the metal. So getting into some more fine trimming, at least the grinding wheel kind of cleans off the edge and makes it really easy to weld. Always got the tin snips handy for those little pieces at the edge. You got to be real careful too, because you're obviously going to cut your fingers up and stuff. So take your time, be patient, be safe. Metal cuts real quick. You don't want to have to get yourself stitches. Do the old duct tape, clean it with brake cleaner and cover your finger with duct tape. Having the firewall on, now everything's lined up. It's pretty much fitting in where I needed to. Unfortunately, the holes that I cut to go around the piping, it was a little off. Like I said, again, with the stencil and the whole deal like that, it's hard to get it really perfect. So once I had those cut, before I started welding everything and getting it all locked in and spot welded and sitting there with the helmet on, I decided I'd go ahead and I'd cut out the tunnel for the drive shaft as well. Using the same gauge sheet metal, I just measured all of the angles and everything and figured out where it was going to fold over. It's pretty simple. There's only going to be 2 bends in this. The key point here is having, when you bend it, that the metal actually fits over the bracket that I made. So it's got to be actually a little further out than the measurement of the bracket itself. So keep that in mind when you're bending it. Maybe if you do your line exactly on point, when you get to the metal shear or the bender like you see here, where I'm just chopping off the edges, making sure it's all nice and clean, and I get rid of the excess right away. When you go to put it in and bend it, you can kind of pull the bend one way or another by where you put it on the line. It goes down in like to a point into a valley to make that metal bend. So when you put it there, if you know that you got to go out a little bit, you just put it on the outside of the line or the inside or vice versa. I should have filmed a better example to show you guys what I'm talking about, but I think you get where I'm going. As you can see here, exactly what I'm saying. We're just folding it out into a box. Very simple. Tricky part is getting it out sometimes. Now that it's all said and done, you got to be sure to get those lines exactly on angle, because if not, you're going to get like a valley where it's less on one side or more on the other. It's going to make it really tough to fit in. But fortunately, I pretty much got it spot on. I don't know how much closer I could have got, but it's a really nice tip. Really nice fit. I had to smack it in there and make it work out properly, but once it was in, I can get it to sit properly where I need it, and it had covered a little more than I needed, so that was a reassurance that I didn't cut my piece too short. And remember guys, you got to measure twice, 4, 5, 6 times, and hopefully only cut once. So with all the pieces together, now it's time that I can actually lock it in and figure out where everything is going to go. I always like seeing progress like this. Having sheet metal in the car is kind of a big deal. It's like when you're building a house and you put your chip rock on the walls, it kind of seals it all up, it covers all the holes up, and it starts to really show you where you're going. So getting this piece done makes me pretty confident, and every time I see something happen like this and kind of works out, it sort of like boosts the morale and it gives me more motivation to keep on going. So that's what we're looking at right now. Some sheet metal from Canadian Tire, maybe not the best place to buy it from because those guys are super expensive, but when you need the metal, you need it. So I went out and I got it. Here we're just gonna have a nice little look at what's been done so far, how it's sitting. I'm starting to feel good about this project. So I'm gonna weld that piece in the back. You do your tack welds, make sure that you don't weld in one spot too much, because number one, you're gonna burn your metal. Number two, if you put too much heat in a certain spot for too long, when the metal starts to retract, when it cools down, you'll start getting bends and it'll start to warp everything you're working on. So here you can see I'm just going around and I'm doing little tiny spots, and eventually I'm gonna go over everything again before the final phases of this build and make sure that all those welds are good, make sure that all the metal is nice and soldered and welded in there solid, because the thing I really don't want to hear is metal rattling when I'm revving the engine or stuff like that. I don't want anything breaking loose and making a whole lot of noise. So that's why I put these brackets in. I made some L brackets that weld onto the frame, basically from the bracket I made for the whole drive shaft tunnel. So it sandwiches the metal in there, gives me some good solid place to weld onto, and kind of makes the whole back half of the chassis rigid. And you want your sheet metal and your floors and your stuff real rigid so that you can bang around in the car and be rough with it. You can stand on it if you have to. If it gets hit, it doesn't matter too much. The whole idea is to make like a tank of a car here that's super strong, durable. It's all Chevy, so it should be easy to run. It should be cheap to run, cheap to maintain. I can go to local car parts and get parts for it. It's got a truck engine in it. All the clutch and everything is going to be from a truck. I'm just trying to make this thing as solid as I can. So now I'm just bracing off the rest of the firewall to give it that kind of sandwiched in metal, strong thing. Now, I don't even know if this is the right process, because like if you're watching this, I'm trying to show you guys that you can do it if you have the idea and just learn a bit of stuff from people that you can, or on YouTube, wherever else. I never went to school for this stuff. I never learned this stuff professional. I worked at a few garages and stuff, but just like side gigs. I haven't been working in a garage for at least 17 years. But just go and move on with the project you want. I decided I wanted to do a car like this, and I've been wanting to do it for a long time. And it's one of those things that you always say, like, oh, one day I'll get to it. But I didn't want it, one day I'll get to it, become to, I wish I got it done. So that's what this is all about, is just basically kind of proving to myself too that I can do it. I have other project cars that I want to do, but my 66 Nova is near and dear to my heart. It's quite a valuable car. It's a rare collector car. And the same thing with the RX-7. If you're following the prices, they're getting all high and crazy. And I just wanted to show myself that I could do something cool like this and build it from scratch and do a good job before I moved on to that stuff. And it shows that anybody can do it. I've been playing around with cars and stuff a long time. I've been around these things all my life, which obviously helps. But if you're really into the car scene and you really want to do stuff like this, you can make friends that have shops or guys that hang around with this stuff. And that's what it's all about, I think, is just building your own example of a car, and then just don't worry about what other people think. I mean, I haven't had any hate for this yet, but I'm sure a lot of people are going to think that I ruined a perfectly good classic car that could have been restored, and maybe I did. But you know what? At the end of the day, I end up with a car that I truly enjoy, a car that I'm truly in love with, and that's all that matters.
If you can't fix what you're